Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Lit Talk. I'm Joe Thimbarello. I'm the director of the Connecticut Literary Festival, and tonight I'll be introducing our programming, Writing Homelands with Korean American Writers. I'm excited to have them all here. The Literary Festival is produced at Central Connecticut State University at the English department, where I'm a faculty member, and we're generously supported by the C2 Humanities. The good people at the C2 Humanities have been supporting the festival since we started the whole enterprise 3 years ago, and they've been a real key to help us navigate this COVID, whatever it is, that kind of spawned Lit Talks. So that's the one good thing that came out of this, is the Lit Talks came out of our inability to do live programming, and we've kept it up. If you're here tonight, this is a special night for us. We have been doing this nonstop for 18 months with our Lit Talks right after COVID hit. And now we're going to take a break for a few months from Lit Talks. So we're excited to have these writers here for the end. The other thing that's coming up that's pretty exciting, last November, I received a phone call from Margaret Gibson, who's the Poet Laureate of the state of Connecticut, about doing some programming around Earth Day. So imagine I'm back in November thinking, I don't know what the hell I'm doing in April. And now I know what I'm doing on April. So on April 22nd at Real Artways, one of our partners in downtown Hartford, the coolest place in the entire state, by the way, we will be there for a day-long festival of poets and the earth, poets celebrating the greener world with Poet Laureate Margaret Gibson and about 30 to 40 other Connecticut poets. We're going to have a food truck because that always makes it more fun. And we'll have a couple bookstores. Review Books will be there, and Grayson Books and some others. So please, if you're in Hartford, please come down and join us. There's programming on our website. If you click that button at the bottom of your screen, you can see all the programming that we're going to do all day. There's even going to be a movie. We've never done a movie before, so we're doing a movie. And that'll be fun. If you can't make it, all the program will be streamed because that's what you do nowadays. And our friend Marks will do that for us. I also want to thank Anna Cristiano. She's kind of our assistant curator for the Lit Talks, and she is our programming manager for them. And also thank you to Julia and Victoria back at our home office who help us do all the other work we do. Lastly, as you think forward, just thinking about the literary arts, of course, we're one of many programs in the state of Connecticut that I hope you will support. And there's just so much good stuff happening as the weather gets nicer. Please try to attend a live event if you can. Do it masked, do it safe. The Sunken Poetry here in Connecticut, but please try to support the literary arts any way you can. So tonight I want to bring up our moderator for the night. Na-Rae Kim is an assistant professor in residence of Asian American Studies at the University of Connecticut, and her research explores 21st century Korean American literary imaginations in South and North Korea. Nice to see you again. You last hosted something for us back at the festival, and I'm sure you've been busy writing and teaching and all those good things. Is that right?
Yep, keeping me busy. But tonight's show is really about our amazing writers. So thank you so much for coming, and I'm really excited to introduce three writers today who will be reading from their books and also will be talking to us about what's going on in their books and in their next projects.
I'm going to hit the audience and say, before I go, I want to say to everyone out there, you can ask a question. If you go to the bottom of your screen, there's an Ask a Question button. You hit that and you type your question, and then our moderator will get to them later in the hour, and you can do some stuff in chat. That's free for you to do. So have a great discussion at the end of the talk. I won't see you, so have a good spring. And take care, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jotham. Thanks everyone once again for coming. I'm really excited to introduce three amazing writers today who have in one way or another engaged Korea in their writings. So I'll first introduce all three. Our first writer, Jimin Han, was born in Seoul, South Korea, and grew up in Rhode Island, Ohio, and New York. Her writing can be found in NPR's Weekend America, Catapult Magazine, Poets and Writers Magazine, and elsewhere. A Small Revolution, her first novel, was among Entropy's Best Fiction of 2017, Pleiades Editors Choice 2017, and Electric Literature's 10 Galvanizing Books about Political Protest. Her new novel, The Apology, is forthcoming from Little, Brown and Company in 2023. I'm going to go ahead and introduce everyone. The second writer is Sophia Kim. She's an actor and writer, a founding member of the Asian American theater company Theater Moo in Minnesota. She has acted in the United States and Korea. She was a Hertog Fellow in the MFA program in creative writing at Hunter College and a participant in Sewanee Writers Conference. The recipient of multiple grants from the Minnesota State Arts Board, she is currently working on her first novel, Tomorrow We Will Celebrate, from which she will read today. E.J. Ko is the author of the memoir The Magical Language of Others, winner of the Washington State Book Award, winner of the Association of Asian American Studies Book Award, and longlisted for the PEN Open Book Award. Ko is also the author of the poetry collection A Lesser Love, winner of the Pleiades Editors Prize for Poetry. She is the co-translator of Iwon's poetry collection, The World's Lightest Motorcycle. Ko has received fellowships from the American Literary Translators Association, MacDowell, and Kundiman. Her poems, translations, and stories have appeared in Boston Review, Los Angeles Review of Books, Poetry Slate, and elsewhere. Ko has earned her MFA at Columbia University in New York for creative writing and literary translation. And Ko is also a PhD candidate at the University of Washington in English literature, studying Korean American literature, history, and film. So without further ado, I'm going to invite the writers to share a short excerpt from their works, starting from Jimin and then Sophia and then EJ.
Thanks so much, Na-Rae. It's such a pleasure to be here and an honor. EJ, I didn't know you got your degree at Columbia. My daughter's graduating from there next month. So excited to be on campus for an in-person graduation. Thank you so much to the Connecticut Literary Festival, Botham, and also Anna. So I'm going to be reading tonight a little bit from my novel, A Small Revolution. I'm so happy. It's really nice to have my name pronounced correctly, Na-Rae, too, I have to say. It's, anyway, I won't go into that at the moment. Okay, the part that I am going to read from, that I don't usually read from, but because we're talking about Korea, is a section that takes place about a third of the way in the book when the main character is in Korea. She's on one of those student tours. She grew up in the United States, but then when she turned 18, her parents sent her to Korea to go on one of these tours where she gets to be introduced to Korea. The novel is written in segmented fiction, which means that it's in these numbered sections. And the section that I'm reading from is all of one pretty long section. So narrator Yuna Lee is talking to, in her mind, this young man, and she's retelling the story of when they were in Korea. I know we're going to talk later about what we're working on next. What I wanted to say was this story being in fragments is written this way because she's in this crisis situation. And just a little content warning, the main character is being held in a dorm room at gunpoint. I want to say, just being an hour outside New York too, we've been like a little traumatized by what happened yesterday. So just a little note about that. Okay. But this is, she's talking to this young man that she fell in love with about, it's a memory of something that happened when they were together in Korea the previous summer. Okay. She's not feeling well. So for a little context, she's not feeling well. And so her friends have taken her to the kitchen behind the Great Hall so that she can get something else to eat. And there they run into this man who's a cook there. So this is the young lady, he said in Korean. I held out my hand in a formal greeting, but he didn't take it. This is the cook. Instead, he motioned for me to sit at the table in the middle of the kitchen. Where is it? He mumbled in Korean and searched in a drawer until he withdrew a spoon and headed for the stove. He proceeded to stir the contents of a small pot and said over his shoulder in English to us, better more time, but what can you do? You explained that I knew Korean. Of course, he replied in English. You have Korean blood. You speak Korean. one people. He nodded at us. One country, all the same people. When he placed a bowl of soupy rice in front of me, I knew that his fourth finger, I saw that his fourth finger had been amputated above the large knuckle. Factory accident, he said in English, as if reading my mind. Tong-Soo Cho held his hand out, finger spread. Many, many, he said, still in English. He means there were other workers who lost their fingers just like him at the factory, she said. That's why he became a cook, Lloyd added. The factory didn't have any safeguards for the workers. It was routine to lose a finger. Tong-Soo nodded at me as if confirming Lloyd's words, pointed at the bowl for me to eat. I spooned some rice and tasted it. The warmth was soothing. It's delicious, thank you, I said in Korean. You speak very well, he said, still in English. And because he spoke to me in English, I figured my Korean wasn't as good as yours or Lloyd's. Eat more, he gestured. Your hand was on my shoulder and I wanted it to stay there. I stirred the chook to cool it. Lloyd was talking in Korean. Mr. Cho, repeat one more time what you told me this morning. Tong-Soo Cho bent his head down, an arm around you and Lloyd in a huddle. In Korean, he said, who benefits if Korea is two separate countries? Kim Il-sung is a strong leader for the people of Korea. He can't be bought by the United States government. Do you understand? No deal. In English, he said it again, no deal. Then he continued in Korean, Kim Il-sung is so strong, even the Japanese respect him. They're supporting him. They're smart. They know who's going to win. And this is a war. Let me tell you, this is a war that will continue. But the North is where the power is, the best factories. My family is from the same area as Supreme Leader Kim Il-sung. If we organize in a smart way, we'll succeed. I promise you. I ate the chook, which had a rich pork broth base, as they talked. But tell Jae-sung where you're going after this, Lloyd urged. This is only a 2-week job, Cho said. Yeah, so tell us what you're doing afterward, you know, in Seoul. Lloyd was nodding and blinking, as if hurrying Cho onward, as if his nods and blinks were hands on Cho's back, pushing him onto a stage. Cho took a breath and paused, looking at each of us to see if we were paying attention before he began. I know a man who knows a man who is Supreme Leader Kim Il-sung's second in command. So, he said, so there's going to be a big protest, Lloyd burst out. Tell him, Mr. Cho, tell him. Oh, that, you said, seeming dejected. You already told me about that. Lloyd leaned forward. But this one's different. He just told me this today. Tell him, he implored Cho. Cho shook his head. I don't know if it's different, but there are leaders who need our help. One who can unify our country. You were suddenly alert. Kim Dae-jung? Cho inspected my bowl. Don't like, he said in English. I replied in Korean, I do, it's good. You gave me a lot, that's all. Come tomorrow, I'll give you more. It'll be better next time. He smiled at me. I felt his approval. Will you be meeting with Kim Dae-jung, Mr. Cho? Is that the secret? Are you planning something? He said. Lloyd was nodding again. I told you, Jason. There's work to do. We'll meet you, wherever you say, he said to Cho, who was wiping down the stove with a sponge. I'm going to stop there. Oh, I can't hear you, Na-Rae. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jimin. Next is Sophia.
Hi. So I'll be reading from one of the opening scenes in Tomorrow We Will Celebrate. The protagonist has just arrived in Korea after, not having, ever since she left, she never returned. So this is the first time in 16 years. I bowed back at the flight attendant as I passed her. Seeing the placid look on her face, it was hard to believe she was the same person who had just shouted moments ago. Her tone stunned me, but it appeared that it was nothing personal, or she didn't care. Whichever it was, something about her two selves unnerved me. You really had no way of knowing what a person was capable of. I followed the crowd to immigration and waited in line in front of an older couple with his and her dye jobs. The man, whose body was the shape of an egg, was no taller than his edgy-looking wife, who wore a Burberry polo shirt. She held her forms with one hand, while the other fluttered over her body, fluffing out her short, stubborn hair, snapping the plaid collar, plucking lint from her front before smoothing it down. He frowned as he watched the officials take one passenger after another. Muttering under his breath, he shook his head, then turned to his wife. Finished? I think so, she said uncertainly. Chum. He snatched the forms and examined them with his puffy eyes. Wait, you put our names in the wrong order, he said, pointing and whining with that sing-songy nag I would often hear from my father on the brink of barely controlled anger. My scalp prickled. The woman peered over his shoulder from the lower half of her glasses with an openness in her face. I was both riveted and embarrassed by them. So engrossed, I didn't notice I was being summoned. Eagle-eyed, the woman spotted the clerk holding up his hand before I did. Over there, she said, jabbing the air. The clerk started to speak in Korean, but I held up my hand with an expression of apology. He regarded me for a few seconds, then switched to English, stamped my passport, and waved me through. When I finally emerged through the automatic frosted doors, I was taken aback at the sight of so many Koreans waving eagerly from behind metal barricades. I hesitated, scanning the crowd for a clue to which direction I should go, when I heard a familiar voice call out my name above the din. My brother Ben was waving behind a woman directly ahead of me. He motioned to meet him past the barricades to my left, then stood waiting in a wide stance with his hands on his hips, smiling big. Dressed in familiar clothes, I could see how much he'd changed. His hair was short and shaved on the sides like most of the other men in the crowd, and he no longer wore an earring, an oddity when he'd first started wearing one, eliciting questions from complete strangers. Why do you pierce your ear? He'd get asked, to which he always responded tartly, why not? I wasn't sure if it was his haircut that gave this impression, but he seemed to have gained weight. Ben hugged me, and I saw a woman behind him avert her eyes. You look stunned, he said, laughing. He put his arm around my shoulders and gave me a playful shake. This is Sora. He turned me toward the woman behind him. Whoever she was, I did not like her at first sight, for without knowing it, I was invoking my father's exacting standards. Standards that forced my mother to get a nose job, my brother to get all of his moles burned off, and made me and my sister forever flinch at the word fat. Sora was thin and petite with large teeth and sharp eyes, both of which grew more pronounced when she smiled. Her hair was dyed an auburn tint, her eyebrows were half-shaven, the arches drawn in. She looked on with erasable surprise, then clasped her hands together and bowed. "안녕하세요," I said, bowing. "Not bad," Ben ribbed me with mock surprise, his eyelashes splaying up like a doll. "Give me that," he said, playfully snatching my suitcase, then led the way out. The air was thick with heat, honking and ceaseless whistling from white-gloved officers directing traffic. We cut across the street and waited in line for a cab. When it was our turn, the driver pulled up and lowered the passenger side window. "Shinchonyo," Ben called out our destination. The driver got out in a shot. Small, bony, and dark with inky-dyed hair, I didn't think he could lift my large suitcase. Eyeing it, he seemed to grow annoyed, impatiently fanning his downturned hand to Ben. He grimaced, heaving it up with both arms in a sudden jerk, and kneed it into the trunk. "Bali, Bali," Sora rushed us, and clambered into the back of the taxi in her pencil skirt. I slid in, then Ben, giving more detailed coordinates. The driver stabbed the meter, and we flew down the highway. Inside, the taxi was covered in a haze of smoke. Through the cloudy windows, I could make out mountains in the distance. I felt emotional at the sight of them for reasons I couldn't understand. When we got closer to Seoul, night fell, and the streets grew flooded with traffic and light. Finally, at an intersection jam-packed with people, the driver pulled over. Ben got out and paid, then pulling my pearly mauve suitcase, set off jauntily through the crowded sidewalk. Music blared surround sound from street vendors, the glass and chrome CD stores, even the glittering makeup shops choked with women. A jumble of Korean rap, Richard Marx, and the unmistakable wail of Whitney Houston's "I Will Always Love You" spilled out onto the streets, blurry with cars and pedestrians. Clutching her purse strap close, Sora trotted ahead of us and slipped into a small restaurant. A moment later, she poked her head out, beckoning us. The restaurant was empty and quiet except for the voices from a TV bolted to the corner of the ceiling. 2 women sat at a table eating melon while picking through a pile of bean sprouts on an open newspaper. "Oseo," one welcomed us as she rose unhurriedly, covering her mouth as she chewed. She stuffed her stocking feet into vinyl slides while motioning us to take a large table in the middle. She went to a side table, poured water into tumblers, and placed them with several packets of wet towels onto a tray. "Ajumma, is the kalbi good?" Sora asked. The word "ajumma" I figured must mean ma'am. "Kuramyo," the waitress said, waving away the question. It was settled, and she collected the plastic sleeves. Just then the door jingled. I looked up to see Cal, our middle brother, walking to us with a balled-up tissue pressed to his nose. "They're spraying tear gas in the subways," he said, his eyes bloodshot.
Thank you so much. Last but not least, EJ.
Thank you, Na-Rae, for bringing us all together, Jimin, Sophia, and myself. And I really appreciate in this moment hearing the parts of your books. And it feels like in this space, our words, they sort of tune to each other's words, and it creates a new meaning. And so I'm really grateful for that. I'm going to read a short section from the book that has to do with my grandmother, Kumiko. Her name is Kumiko because she was born and raised in Tokyo, in Shinjuku and Ueno. And when she turned 19, her parents told her that she was actually Korean and they had fled Jeju Island. So they had to flee once again after passing for many years. They went back to Jeju, and this section is going into the military suppression campaign that happened on Jeju, and it was carried out by Korean National Police, but also backed by the US military. And Kumiko and her mother and father were able to escape into the mountain in a shack. And but her mother was so frantic, she begged Kumiko's father to go down and check on their friends and family, which Kumiko protested quite heavily, but he ended up leaving, going back down the mountain. And now it's been several days of Kumiko waiting with her mother. When Kumiko and her mother came down the mountain, the island was scorched. They passed through burnt villages, their voices lodged in their throats. Many of the dead could not be found, their bodies tossed over cliffs, hidden away in caves, or chopped into bits, signs of covering up. Mothers cupped the air with their hands, holding the missing faces of their husbands and sons. Their wailing and screaming filled the hearts of all who sifted through the remains. Teeth, hair, dead horses and pigs, then mosquitoes. The smoke reddened the sun. They covered their mouths, or they would taste the corpses. There were children, the girls Kumiko played with, and women and men lying with limbs bent over each other, splayed across the road. Tens of thousands of them idle along collapsed terraces where the islanders once danced, pumping with life. It was Kumiko who crossed the road over a bridge and came to a part of the ground soaked in blood. When she asked after her father, somebody pointed to this ground. She saw nothing except the many faces around her, mouths wide and sullen. One islander, a grandmother, said to her, "Your father was captured at the bottom of the mountain and dragged into a demonstration." She explained that a demonstration was a public display. A group of men, unfed and irate, corralled a crowd together. They put on such displays on behalf of the country and on higher orders, foregoing restraint. What evil was born out of demonstrations? Then where is he? Kumiko asked. The grandmother opened her palm toward the ground. Here. Looking closer, flesh and bone, gristle mistaken for bark and debris between the stones. At once, the road became vivid, and Kumiko recognized her father. Road. Father. Road. They stoned him until he was gravel, the grandmother said, as though she were not speaking to Kumiko, but a deity who had come down from the mountain to judge her for the truth. Many of us stoned him to prove our innocence. We stoned our own, again and again. They stoned him over nights. They pitched blunt rocks harder over days, for sport, until finally boredom, before the body was pulverized. What was exchanged between the police and the groups of men and the islanders, between the rocks and the bones, between the body and the road? What was supposed to be understood? Though they did not know it, the days that Kumiko and her mother spent hiding on the mountain were given a name. And such were the questions raised by the Jeju Island massacre of April 3rd, 1948.
Thank you so much for that reading. I really love how all the readings are coming together, threaded by various different themes, and it's just really, really wonderful to hear it from your own voice. So I really want to thank you on behalf of everyone. So I wanted to ask a few questions, and I will soon open it to the audiences. So audiences, if you have any questions, please type it to the question and answers, ask a question section at the bottom of the screen. But for now, I wanted to pose a few questions. First of all, I wanted to ask all of you to speak briefly about what it means to write about Korea or write Korea. All of you literarily, imaginatively, discursively engage Korea either through personal history or through your characters' literal and figurative visit to Korea. What are the draws and drawbacks about writing about Korea by Korean American writers, and to engage with that position in your aesthetic innovations. So if you guys can speak briefly about that, it would be great.
That's such a huge question, right? You know, I just because we heard EJ, there's this line that is in the intro. I feel like in a lot of ways, fiction is this for me. And, you know, of course, have a poet be able to express it in this way. There's a line here. So EJ, if you allow me, to my limits, I do not see my translations as complete. And this is in reference to the letters, right? They're translated. If her letters could go to sleep, my translations would be their dreams. And I love that because I feel like writing, particularly this novel, it was kind of this it's this dream. I went to Korea when I was the same age as Yuna, and I didn't understand what was happening. And writing this book allowed me to imagine and fill in and think about what was happening around me. And very much like a dream, I researched things, but of course, it really was about imagining. And it was filling in holes in terms of things I'd heard from my family, in terms of first accounts I'd read. So I would just start with that a little bit. It helped me. I wrote it in order to help my cousins who were younger than me, so that maybe they could understand a little bit. Being in the United States, it just felt so cut off from so much of what was happening there. And I came when I was 4, and my grasp of the language is not very good. So I'll just say that to start us off, and then I'd love to hear what AJ and Sophia have to say.
I can go ahead. Thank you for sharing that, Jimin. That's so kind, and I didn't even recognize myself in those words. They sort of came from the air, and I so appreciate how you bring them to life again, and so it means a lot. I think one of the ways in which I connect and use my imagination with the subject of Korea and being Korean American might be primarily through the translation of my mother's letters. So for those who don't know, it's a memoir, and the memoir is sort of there are sort of chapters that are translations of my mother's letters to me when I was a young girl, during the time that my parents left for South Korea, leaving me behind in California. And she raised me through her letters. And so look, I just did not plan to become a translator, and I didn't know the significance of that until I found her letters, and that I had not thrown them away as I thought, but I had collected them over the years. And so the book is a memoir, but it started really as a translation project. I was sitting down, reading my mother's letters again, and I think as a translator, I had been taught to do a sort of very neat and tidy translation, something that's more literal, and so that I'm translating my mother's letters from Korean to English as if they were already written in English. And it took me a few years to see that by translating, I was performing a different kind of act. And what I wanted to do was go back and translate, because for me, I think languages, they are connected to countries, and those countries have histories. And when you put them together, there are going to be dominant and non-dominant, historically speaking, languages. And so it felt like a kind of erasure to translate my mother's letters in that way. And so I went back and I translated my mother's letters into English, but this time choosing words that sometimes sounds more Korean versus the meaning being quite right, or finding rhythms and spaces so that when you hear the letters read out loud, you don't say that's a letter in English. You could hear the Korean, and you could feel where the words might point to, so that there is no erasure. Rather, there is a constant presence. And that sense of presence of having my mother stay on the page was a way of me connecting to her to close the distance between us and close the distance between me and Korea.
So yeah, it is a big question. I think that the reason why I'm drawn to using Korean words, and when I do, is because I am trying to get closer to how I talk, how I speak with my family, but especially my mother. And in that way, I'm trying to render someone, someone like my mom, visible. And I think that, so that's one part of it. And I think it's also, in a fun way for me, it's to see what I can get away with language. How much Korean can I use and not lose the reader? How much Korean can I use imagining a really strong reader and have them come along with me on this journey? The reason why I write about Korea is I think that Toni Morrison talks about how in the book, The Source of Self-Regard, she talks about how the act of imagination is bound up with memory. And that makes so much sense to me because I think I'm always, whether it's the Korean language or my memories of Korea, I'm trying to always hold them, and then that fuels my imagination. And I don't know, recently I was thinking about this word parallax, and I was thinking about, so it's when you hold an object and it's displaced depending on where the observer is standing. And so sometimes I'm looking at something as an American, and sometimes I'm looking at something as a Korean American, and that I'm constantly doing that throughout the day. And in my manuscript, I realized what I was doing was I'm starting it from one vantage point, and you see slowly how that perspective shifts. And that's done through her observations and also language. So these are some ways that I work with Korea and Korean language.
Thank you so much for all your wonderfully insightful and beautiful answers. On that last note, Sophia, I also wanted to ask all of your thoughts on how you arrived at your voice. You guys have really interesting perspectives and voice and tone. Jimin, you utilized the figure of Yuna. It's her largely your novel is her first person perspective, but she's removed temporally and geographically in the section that you read from her current situation in which she's held captive, right? And also there is the sense that she's actually removed from the realities of Korea as a Korean American person who doesn't fully grasp what's going on, right? So there is that kind of really wonderful distance and wanting to understand that is juggled through Yuna's voice. And similarly, Sophia, your beautiful details that come alive so vividly in your first person perspective also has the degree of detachment and attachment that the protagonist, is juggling, right? And I wanted to know what's going on there and why you chose that particular perspective and voice. And EJ, your memoir is really an interesting experimentation, for the lack of a better word, of different voices that come together, as you say, the translation and your actual physical insertion of your mother's letter. I think that was really important, and your own personal voice, but also it's really interesting that the two grandmothers that you talk about, which form really important moments in your memoir, are written in third person, and you actually refer to them by their name, Kumiko. So I was wondering if you guys can talk a little bit about that particular perspective, voice, the choices, thoughts that go into that.
Um, I- so this is a great question. I have a new book coming out in a year that's completely different, and it's from and just raising the point just to compare. It's by a 105-year-old Korean woman in Korea who travels to the United States, and it's just one long rant. She's just talking about this trip, and it's called The Apology because it's this Koreans and their apologies, right? and all of the emotion that goes into this. And so it's the opposite of what I have Yuna going through in A Small Revolution. And I think that that this idea of having these fragments, and it was the only way I could write this book because of all the things that I was searching for while I was writing it, and for her to be at the age where she was discovering all of this. And what Sophia said so beautifully about language too, which is I didn't know how to convey this, and I didn't arrive at this sort of pastiche of time and perspectives in terms of the angles of her talking about this until it was kind of shattered. So that's why it's in all these pieces. And I think it was an attempt, all the white space. Like I really wanted to be a poet first. That was the first thing I always wanted to be, and I never. So, but I write this, and so all the white space allowed for what was missing, would be just the gaps, and it really was the only way that I could write that. So I think that was your in terms of voice. It's I think each project requires a particular voice, particular approach, and this one was, it was artificially constructed with a crisis to put pressure on this shattering. But I feel like for Yuna as a character and for things that I saw around me, that was my experience. I felt like there were pieces. And so in a fictional world, I was able to kind of create it like that. And then you've got the 105-year-old character next who just got to smoothly say what she wanted. So I'm very curious to hear what the others have to say in answer to your question.
So I am really, really interested in the Kyopo's experience, and whatever meaning you want to attach to that meaning. I think that there are different connotations that people have when they hear the word Kyopo, good or bad. But just what I mean by Kyopo is the Koreans who were basically raised outside of the Korean peninsula. I think for many of us, we have lived most of our lives kind of as interpreters or translators for our parents, and so I wanted to have a story that was entirely about her experience and her lived experience, and not a story about her parents. And that comes out later. But just as an artist and as a writer, that's kind of this obsession with me is how do I say this? Like when you spend most of your life kind of like, talking for others, who talks for you, and who tells your story. And so I think that's why I chose this particular voice.
It's really interesting to hear everyone's answers. I think for voice, I don't really know. I feel like all my answers are guesses, and they change as I keep writing, but I suspect it comes from poetry. I think poetry is the first place that took hold of me. I think it was the first time that I came to writing, and I was really confused because in the beginning I was able to start poems, but I wasn't able to finish them. And I remember my first poetry teacher taking me in during a really hard time in my life and explaining that to get to the turn, which is tends to be the last line or two of a poem, you have to use magnanimity. And that's something that stayed with me. I didn't know what that word was at the time. And when I asked, they said very simply that it means that if you're writing a poem about your mother, you have to forgive your mother by the end of the poem, or the poem has to forgive you for not. And it meant if you can't do that, it's a journal. It's a diary entry. It's not a poem. And so it was hard. It was hard, but really important for me to practice. How do you write while imagining yourself to be able to do something you cannot do in the present moment? How do you love the things you've never known? How do you see beauty if you've never felt it before? And so poetry and a sense of magnanimity, I think, came to the translation, and particularly fiction, because I would sort of almost like a baking roller, like sort of I would go over and over again over every part of the book to just ask myself some really hard questions about whether I'm able to access any magnanimity or grace beyond what I'm capable of doing at this present moment. And in that, the actual process itself became a challenge of changing who I was, so that by the end of the book, I also became in ways unrecognizable to myself, to the person that started the book. So.
Thank you, everyone, for your answers. It's really thought-provoking, especially thinking about how your answers really come together. It's really really wonderful. I have a lot of questions, but I'm sure the audiences have a lot of questions. So if you guys want to ask some of the questions, let's open the floor so that people can directly ask questions to our writers. Anna, I don't really know how I can see that or access them.
Are they supposed to be in the chat? I don't see any questions.
Oh, I see. Okay. Does audience have any question? Do you guys have any questions for any writers or everyone in general? And while we're waiting, do you guys have questions for each other? Or
I
any
have a
thoughts?
question. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead. All right.
Oh, no, I was going to say, or any comments or things that you want to
Oh.
share.
I wanted to ask EJ about, the question you just raised about arriving at an understanding at the end, and I certainly feel that way about writing. I didn't know how any of the books are going to end until I got there. So just curious about in terms of writing poetry and about writing memoir, if you see what the differences are, or if you found something, if you want to sort of speak to writing in these different genres. Oh, and here comes a question from Kate. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jimin. And I'm really excited about your next book, The Apology. Just the way you described it about a 105-year-old woman just sort of speaking and ranting. And I feel like I'd already read that in one sitting. There's no way I would be able to let something like that go. So I'm excited to hear, if we have time, to ask you more about your process in sort of maintaining and creating a story from just her speaking. And I love that very, very much. With poetry and prose, it's so interesting because I think at the beginning I did feel a pretty clear distinction, enough that I sort of came to the desk very differently. But as time has passed, I feel less and less of that distinction, especially with my newer poems. They're sort of longer and they're connected in passages or sort of prose poems in sections, and I love the idea of giving them chapters. But like American Han, that one is sort of has photographs as well as long passages that seem like just like you're reading prose, but something about, and so I'm writing prose right now, and that seems to be in a similar place. I go to prose with a similar mindset of I'm just sort of writing on the page, and I'm not thinking about the genre exactly. But I would say in some ways poetry feels like it's got a little teeth in it. It's a little, you get to the sharp end faster, and you tend to cut right in the beginning. I think something like that is always helpful. You sort of make the wound, and then you see and go about it. Whereas prose is really interesting in that you need a view of the flesh first. You need the whole thing to really grasp what the wound is and why it's there and how it feels. Whereas in poetry, it's more seeing the wound itself has a sort of its own effect. And I think it's really great to use poetry in prose the way I did, or the Road Father Road section in Magical Language of Others sort of is an echo of sort of visual poetry. The way I might use parentheses is the way I would use it in poetry, but I like using it in prose that way, or playing with spacing the way I like the block text to remain blocks, because I don't like the word widows, and that's what copywriters call it, right? If there's a dangling word or two, I think that's strange. So I will excessively create block passages, but I think little things cross over, and I like that. I think it makes it a little quirky.
I was really curious how you will actually read that part. When I see it on the page, there's this bracket, so it was really interesting to hear that. Thanks for that answer. I think all the questions are coming in now. I don't think we have time for everything, but some of the questions that came up is dealing with, I think, if I can try to combine Kate's question and Nicole's question, when you're writing about something so personal and raw and emotional, what challenges have you faced? Do you have to take yourself out of it, or do you fully embrace it, or sort of face the trauma all over again to make the writing more effective? And I think that sort of chimes with Kate's question, do you actually have a homesickness when you also write about it? So I think we can get to that, and I think that also sort of ties in with Nayoung's question about the theme of memory that threads everything, in the sense that Korea that you talk about are both very felt and experienced and accessed through memory. So if you guys want to take it in whichever order or way or form, in parts as a whole.
I'd actually like to answer that question about the homesickness. It is actually, my story started out because I was going through a really difficult time, and then I thought, when was I the happiest? And it brought me back to Korea at a particular time. That, Korea has changed so much, and that area in particular, Sinchon near Yonsei University, is unrecognizable now, like it was in 1994 through, until 1996, which is when I was there. It's kind of an homage to that period of time and that part of Seoul that I wrote. And it's, the writer Edward P. Jones talks, and he writes about Washington, D.C., and he said that Washington, D.C. does not exist anymore. And Korea has changed, like some areas are left untouched, and then there are certain areas that are just completely changed. And so my writing about that particular time period was my way of preserving it, and just to have it last in a way.
I can really appreciate that. I lost my mother a few years ago, and I think that the apology, which I wrote after that, is sort of an attempt to I don't really want to, I guess I want to say I allowed myself in some way, because my mother had this incredible sense of humor. And so I played with stories that were in our family. And so this 105-year-old woman is based on an aunt of mine. And I don't know if it was because of the pandemic and all this stuff, but and I know it's my writing group and my friends who read parts of this, and they just liked what I was writing about this old woman. And so in terms of homesickness and memory, the book gave me a place to play in a way. And I got to just kind of remember these stories about this part of our family. I don't know what part's real. I don't know if all of it's, gossip. And I also got to revisit those stories and relationships. They're sisters. I don't have two brothers. My mother is one of three sisters and four sisters, really. And so I gave the main character this. And so I was able to put in things, and it was an opportunity to play in this way. I didn't give myself that chance in A Small Revolution to stretch and not, and it's strange because as much as I miss my mother, it was an opportunity. I don't know how close it is, but it felt like I could hear some of those things that she would tell me about this time in her life and in Korea. So it was really healing for me in the process of writing it. And of course, what comes out of that is a whole other thing, a whole new thing. But it should be called Gossip, really not the apology. Right? Like the whole book should probably just be called Gossiping Among Your Aunts. So it's been nice to have my cousin's wife who grew up in Korea, came here in her 20s, say, "Oh, you got these things right," and to have some other friends say, "Yeah." So
That's so wonderful to hear. I need a writing group. That's just a wonderful way And I loved hearing you describe the reactions of your first readers. I thought Sophia and Jimin both answered that question so beautifully. I might just say really quickly this other question here about whether I'm sort of reliving the raw and emotional moments in the book. And I think it's a little different with this new book I'm working on, but at least with the magical language of others, I sort of put myself on the line a little too much, I would say. It was not the healthiest way of going about it. We talk about this distance, how if I'm sobbing writing something, the reader might be sad a little bit. And I really have to be racking with pain for the reader to feel even a little teardrop. But I remember sort of resisting that feeling because I thought I would like to do this for a lot longer and be healthy. And so I just think taking care of myself is really important. Taking good care of my health, getting outside, walking, being very, very gentle with myself, being very kind to my writing, and every day just reminding myself that, like Jimin said, I'm having fun. This is something to play with. This is something I want to explore. And so those things sort of help me sit down and get to the really difficult subjects, like it might be Han, it might be my grandmother, it might be the massacre and whatnot. But those other things help me get really down to those subjects.
Thank you. I know that we're already a little bit over time, and I'm so sorry that we cannot get to all the questions. But while we have all the writers, I really wanted to ask one last question, which is if you can speak a little bit about your next project. I know, Jimin, that you started sharing a little bit, whether it is literal next book or the book that you're currently writing or your dream book that you know that you will one day write. If you can share a little bit about other things at the back burner or front burner, I would really love to hear that as our last conversation.
Yeah, so the apology is going to come out next year. There's nothing much for me to do but do some copy edits that are coming up. The one that I'm working on now that I really had a tough time with beginning, but now sometimes if you set it up in the first 100 pages, then it feels like everything that you set into motion, now you can watch it go downhill. You know? So, and again, it's so just quickly, it's a feud, and I was feeling very upset by a lot of things in it because of some of the personal stuff in it, and I decided to just like move the relationships around and put a little distance. It's become fun again. So yes, that one's coming out, I hope, in a few years. That's what I'm working on now.
I'm working on a novel right now, which Na-Rae you know about, and I'm still in the very beginning stages, and I'm so glad to get the chance to show you a bit of the very beginning parts of it. But I'm enjoying it a lot. It's almost taking some of my parents' stories and grandparents' stories in the memoir and sort of what they would look like extended, and if they sort of reached out and touched me and sort of my story in the Korean diaspora, and how that how a Korean, like where's the joy in being Korean American, really? Where is, the other stuff that I've been missing? And I'm also, other than that, I write love letters to strangers. If you haven't heard of it, I'm still writing them, but and the info is on my website. But I started many years ago. I decided to write 1,000 love letters to strangers, and anyone can write me, and I will handwrite them a love letter. And mail it off. But I think today I just sent my 363rd third love letter, and so I'm slowly making my way to 1,000, but really just being in the process of connecting one-to-one to strangers by letters has been keeping me alive.
Wait, EJ, do you keep them? Do you keep a copy, or when you send it by hand and write? I'm sorry, I have to ask. When you send them off, or do you ever do you have a record of them?
I send them all. I do have some of them if they wanted to share it with me, or they wanted to post it or say how it affected them. But I started it many years ago. Maybe it's been, I started maybe 2016, and so it'll be a long time before it's finished. But yeah, it's just practicing love, making it a daily place I go to.
Those sound so nice. Because I'm still working on completing my manuscript, I've found that it's a little bit tricky to talk about new projects and to start them, because then the energy seems to, I only have so much energy, and but I do have another play in mind, another novel based on my early immigrant childhood, and maybe a shorter book of essays from a trip back to Korea in 2017. So those are some ideas that I have.
Thank you so much for sharing wonderful parts of your writings and your thoughts and your journey. And I really loved getting to know a little bit more from your readings and from your answers. Thank you so much for the space and for sharing really important parts of yourselves. And thank you so much for to the audiences for coming and being together at this really wonderful time and event. Please consider coming to the Earth Day Poetry event, which will be phenomenal. And I hope that you guys have a wonderful evening ahead. Thank you.